apparently are online. Our connections are okay, at least for the moment. So we are on another evolution hour with our ongoing analysis of Nathaniel Jeanson's interminably not helpful attempt to go with the biological data. And then our exciting little part two, where we're going to pick up where we left off a little bit ago on Hugh Ross's universal flood and what he's trying to do with human migrations. And in their own way, Jeanson and Ross are playing the same sort of fudge games with their material. But we'll get at all of that in the moment. Let's remove our largely illegible patrons. I will say again, every patron who has kept going through all of the ups and downs of life, it is an enormous benefit to keeping out every single week and to keep in ink and all the little things that are required for scholars to do their thing and work on subsequent works that will hopefully add to the knowledge of human beings as opposed to diminishing them, which is what so often we get from anti-evolutionists and other points. So first, dear old Jeanson. As I've been pointing out in previous weeks, he's not exactly been a gangbuster pileup of technical citations. And somewhere, I suspect, in these appendices at the end of the book is where there'll be a tidal wave that'll catch up with a lot of the technical literature that he's dangling elsewhere, because he's starting to run out of pages to be able to get at a lot of this stuff. But he's still running pretty much bad for the form in bypassing information and stepping around stuff and dangling sources that are not actually helping his case much. And this latest case involves haplotype T, which is figures in Jewish populations, and it includes maybe the Lembas of Africa, who have a tradition of having some Jewish descent, which Jeanson appears to favor based on some website posts to it. Oddly enough, not detailing much of the technical information, plus the paper that he's going to be citing actually went into this in a bit of detail. As for the chronology, his compression ratio pegs the split with the earlier L haplogroup at, quote, 2200s BCE to 1900s BCE, at least according to another of his little color plates that he has in the book, which you can see here is not exactly filled with information. A, you'll notice there are no sources. You can see my little annotations on there. And B, no chronology. It's just got like time and dates and all of that. That actually is referring to information that comes from the one paper he cited, which is from Mendez 2011. And I'll be putting a link into that where that actually identifies all the little subgroups and details and also provides dates on them. So another interesting thing about the Jeanson thing that I found out from reading the T haplotype that I found out from reading the paper, Mendez, is that this J haplotype figures in Thomas Jefferson's lineage. So it pops up in little odd areas around the world, which is why it was such an interesting little thing to feature with. And so this newer, more detailed study, which is basically the study that addresses this particular haplogroup, went into quite a bit of details, quite a lengthy paper. Anyway, Jeanson figures that his range, compressing it down to 2200 BC to 1900 BC, which is immediately after the flood in his model. And by the way, remember what the problem was last week, where we were having the patriarchal group, which actually does date back to that period. He has to pull down millennia out of remove, but now he's not doing this. Anyway, he thinks this, quote, overlaps the time of the early Israelite patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, unquote. So how much of that is helping up? Well, according to the paper, the one and only source, which he kind of sort of did, he said he extracted data from it, that the haplogroup is known, quote, began to diversify in the Near East around 25,000 years ago, with the particular sets of subgroups Jeanson is invoking branching in a period before 17,000 years ago for the one group, and then around 7,600 years ago for the later one. all vastly older than the time frame that Jeanson is talking about, and technically speaking, before the creation of the universe. As for the Lemba people, the most the paper asserted on that particular group supports, quote, a Near Eastern but not necessarily a Jewish origin for their paternal line, unquote. So even in that area, it is stretching the data field. He's going to be touching on other haplotypes later on in the group, as I can see from what he's been hinting at. And I'm not holding my breath that he's going to be doing any better on that, but all the technical papers that are open access that he'll be bumping into, we're going to be talking about and linking to, so you can take a look at it yourself and make the comparison. Now, part 2 relates to good old Hugh and his foray into the flood that I mentioned a ways back. He had an 11-page pamphlet that Reasons to Believe put out freebie, and I'm putting the link up to it. So if you want to go try and download it yourself, find it dandy, they may still be offering it. Anyway, their scenario is the flood was universal, but not global. And in that all of humanity lived in a single spot during this period. And the inundation came along and wiped everybody out because of their sin, because the Bible says so, except for the people on the ark and the local animals associated with them. You assume farm animals and that were there. Ross is not going into a great deal of detail on any of this stuff. He's not telling us how many animals on the ark. I mean, it's a big ark. There's a lot of animals. And exactly where was the ark, and even kind of detail about the when, because he put up what I found an absolutely gobsmacking thing. The only specific that he puts into this pamphlet is that he dates it 50,000 plus or minus 40,000 years ago, which means from about 10,000 BC to 90,000 BC would be the range in there, which is just sprawling across a huge swath of human evolution and dispersals out of Africa. But here's the problem. That Ross is clearly arguing that it's a one-way trip from the ark into Africa, not people from Africa migrating multiply out of Africa. So Ross has two sources for this assertion, one of which is himself. It's Reasons to Believe, Explore blogs that he came up with, where the one example relating to human history concerned the late 1990s dispute over thermoluminescence dating of some Australian rock carvings. And ironically, some of the researchers have been party to subsequent work who pushing the Australian back to 60,000 years, none of which is alluded to by Ross in his discussion on this in this little blog post. But it gets worse. The one technical paper that he cites is Parton 2015, and I'll be putting a link up to that through ResearchGate, which certainly accepted the African populations going in the other direction, multiple excursions from Africa into Eurasia, and all of which are coming in a time frame that's not helping his model at all. Even if he's trying to reverse the direction, the dates aren't connecting up. The one is 160 to 150,000 years ago. The second branching is 130 to 75,000 years ago. And only one then 55,000 years ago is kind of sort of close to the ballpark that Ross is offering it. Good gravy. This is a vaguely superficial argument, because we need to know, like, where is he claiming human beings were so sequestered? And he can't just wave away the archaeological material, which just keeps on accumulating, even though he doesn't bother citing any of it, as if it didn't matter. So methodologically, in terms of the superficiality of taking an a priori assumption that the Bible must be accurate, they're going to simply rearrange the time schedule and have Middle East Ararat somewhere involved, not necessarily Ararat, but somewhere in that region, which is the traditional Bible area, acting as the conduit for people coming out of Africa. This is absolutely identical to the young Earth creationist model. except the chronology is spread out, the reverse of the young Earth creationists, but it's exactly the same thing. It's that people are only in one particular spot and then spread out and form these various nations and groups. It won't wash for Jeanson's argument, and it's a wash for Ross's. And it'll be amusing to see if he ever offers any more detail than what we're getting from this little blog. Now, he also alludes to a book that he wrote on this matter, which I do not have access to. However, the experience I've had with Hugh Ross's other books, going back decades, is that, Ross, suddenly I have a little black screen there, screensaver kicked in, that Hugh Ross routinely cites himself, citing himself. And there's always been less sizzle to his steak than meets the eye. Because when you finally can burrow down, if he even bothers to offer a technical citation, it's not really very significant anymore or helping his case any more than this Parton paper was from 2015. So I'm not holding my breath, but if anybody has access to said book, and there's a reference to, because if you follow in on Ross's Reason posting, you can see the works in that he's citing to there. If anybody wants to donate that to the project, I will be fine to add it on to the list of source citations to go through and generate a source analysis in future. But his previous works are not notably more solidly documented than Jeanson's are. So they're methodological twins, but they're operating at opposite polarities as to the chronology. But methodologically, they're riffing off of an extremely narrow database and misrepresenting that and failing to work through their models sufficiently to present a detailed case. Jeanson at least is kind of sort of trying to go through methodically all these different haplotypes. He's stumbling miserably, but Ross doesn't get him into that far, which I think is reinforcing the issue that old Earth creationism is pretty moribund. You've got a few people orbiting reasons to believe who would be linking to it on occasion. And I bump into once in a while a Ross groupie on Twitter, but they're few and far between. You're more likely to have people and Joel Duff and other people who keep track of these things online as well can give me some input if they have information to the contrary. Gutsick Gibbon, Dapper Dino, all that group. That intelligent design apologetics is encountered as secondary linkages more frequently than old Earth creationist Hugh Ross. But both of those combined shrink to insignificance compared to the number of creationists that are drawing on Answers in Genesis, CMI, and the like. In the pompous technical citation sorts, the ones that are the kind of interesting ones are the Hovindistas, because Hovind has a lot of very specific tropes, particularly the 6 forms of evolution, which is one of his little hobby horses. So typically speaking, when you encounter a creationist online that brings up the 6 kinds of evolution and they talk about cosmic evolution and all the rest, they're probably riffing off of Kent Hovind, but they're usually kind of reluctant unless pressed to admit that they're riffing off of Kent Hovind. At which point one can say, oh, you take Kent Hovind seriously? You cannot be taken seriously. Sorry. Off the scope. Anyway, so it's going to be interesting to see finally how long it takes Jeanson's book to start reeling in the technical literature. There's also some obscure goof-ups in terms of alphabetization in the reference bibliography that he offers. There's several examples of things that are not in alphabetical order. He doesn't know how the letters work in the alphabet for categorizing. So a paper that ought to be farther down on the list is actually in a different spot because he's misalphabetized it. And although it is certainly possible I know in constructing the reference bibliography for those works, it's very easy to add in material and accidentally paste it into the wrong spot. And so something is out of sequence. But in principle, you should be going through all of that source by source to make sure that everything is proper before you get to the publication stage. And apparently he doesn't do that. It's also interesting where technical literature, and I'll be continuing to follow up on that as to the best of my ability, technical literature that could have been supplied on these issues. We've already done that in some previous episodes of why didn't he cite X and Y and Z? The absence of a source is just as glaring. On the reference bibliography, I make it a point of marking in some of these little spots of where a source should have been had he drawn on a relevant paper, the Fu paper being the most obvious, which he can't possibly argue that he didn't know about it by 2021, and yet it doesn't appear anywhere in the book. Absolutely fascinating stuff. So those are the kinds of little trails that a scholarly analysis can do that you can miss if you only look at the content level. And you could easily plow down through Jeanson's book and go, wow, there's not a hell of a lot there. And some of the critics in that have done exactly that. But coming at it backwards from the source level to see, okay, this is a source he's citing here, and this is a source he is citing there, and when is he going to cite that one, and why isn't he citing this, and he apparently doesn't even know about that, is putting a mirror up to measure the relatively superficial level of the scholarship, given the apparent gravitas of the subject. This was supposed to be just an absolute gigantic work. Ken Ham praised it as this massive effort. And apparently, apart from Ken Ham's AIG, that's as far as it's going, even in the creationist community. And so it's going to be interesting to see as the years go by, is he going to have to do a follow-up book? And will it redress any problems that are in the previous books? Or will he just be retreading the same reel? Or the lazy approach is to just rest on the laurels, do posts at Answers in Genesis, and maybe occasionally popping over to ICR just for fun and CMI, and do the blog posts and all of that, and have Standing for Truth hovering around and repeating everything he says. And yet, and when he wants to talk about, oh, I cover in full detail in Traced, and therefore don't bother me, kid. We'll see whether or not that's the approach that he takes, but it ain't going to convince, I don't think, many people, even in the creationist community, let alone anybody outside of it. So that kind of covers the material. We got 18 minutes in without any glitches, apparently. It's been hot as Hades in Spokane again, and the temperature's supposed to be going up, shooting past the 80s into the 90s by the middle of the week. So fortunately, my niece and her husband had come by last year to bring me a little air conditioner cooler thing that I can attach in the back room to pump air in and get things a bit stabilized. Plus, it's an old forced air furnace heating system, which you can flip off the heating mode and open up a vent and turn it into an air pump that pumps air from the basement, which is a natural cooler anyway. It tends to stay quite a bit cooler down to the basement, regardless of what the temperature is upstairs. And that can then circulate all that around. And so hopefully it won't be too icky during the summer. The one, at least advantage we have in Spokane, Washington, is that we're not terribly humid. Whereas even a 70-degree day in Chicago, you're turning into a puddle. And anywhere in the east, it's like that. And then the south, Louisiana, and all that. Whereas it's comparatively dry here. So there we muddle along on the situation. We're continuing to work on Rocks Were There Volume 2 and Paralogs 3. And I'm also been tinkering on the little side with my Politique game, making some adjustments on making these little tiles that I can then put up and assemble and simply attach to a game board that I can buy from a company, and they'll do all the pieces and cards printed up and all that kind of stuff. Hopefully next year, I'll be able to wrangle that little operation and get a test model available, because there's big gaming clubs over in Seattle area. They have a big convention every year. The one just this month, in fact, over in started with an L, over in the Seattle area. And then there's a variety of little gaming clubs here in Spokane. And I want to have people doing some play testing of the new version of the game. When I had gone down to Grand Canyon with our Colton bunch and Dapper Dino and all the rest for our grand adventure, we all brought games and stuff with us, and we all played various games, and I was able to get some little play testing and some critiques of details of the politique game, and I've incorporated these various bits about how to make power cards. Whoop, we don't have black screen again. How to get power cards worth $5 at the end of the game, and a few things there, and that spurred on a whole network of where I've upgraded the structure of these game cards to mirror the structure of some of the other game cards. And I think now it's just ratcheted up to a much nicer game format. And I have all sorts of skill sets. The last time I did a board for it was like 1975, 80, somewhere around in there. It's a long time ago. And very, very rudimentary. I put things down on an Avalon Hill, blank boards that I could buy. And so that restricted the size of the board. And the newer format, you can get 24 by 24 boards. And so that allows more space to work with. And I was able to enlarge the board details and add on some extra C-squares. So it's what difference a few decades makes in terms of the accessibility. In other words, what you have is game makers have access to professional printing and manufacturing stuff on the fly, individual piecework, in the same way that Amazon prints my books. And so it gives some options to be able to pull things off. Anyway, I want to have play testing both for the basic game, which is 2 to 6 players, and then if we can bite the bullet to get some in more than 6 players to be able to test out that tournament game and see how all that's running. So anyway, that's what's keeping me busy here. And the one advantage of being a night owl is that the temperature gets a little cooler at night. And so I can open the doors and let some cool air in and wait until it's in the wee hours of the morning before I actually have to go to bed. Tomorrow, I got to get up fairly early and get the car serviced. It's got a little warning thing that came up. B123 servicing detail. I have no clue what the hell that is. So we'll find out tomorrow. And if it's a ton of money, I may have to delay it until July, or if I got enough squeaky to run around, I'll get the thing serviced this month. Anyway, that keeps us up to steam on things. Keep up the sound methods. Watch what's happening in the political realm and the social realm in terms of people of unsound method in your local environment. Get in contact with like reporters and others to get them to use source methods and ask source methods questions. And if not, if you're at a public hearing of where politicians are out there, ask what information do they rely on? Do they fact check it? I think the vast majority of politicians of all political parties, but certainly the Rhino Trumpistas, don't really do that. And we've discovered over the last decades that people who have bad methods like that, who get into power, are going to screw things up. How can they avoid doing otherwise when their methodology is so incompetent? They rely on bad sources that reinforce the dogmas that they want to be true, and they don't fact check them at all. And these spill over into other areas because so many of them become anti-vaxxers and they're opposed to climate change, amelioration, and there's a whole bunch of things that are going to be affecting our lives and health over the next decades. And I'm an old fart, so my lifespan is not as extended, but anybody as young as my co-author Jackson Wheat, he's going to have to live in that world for decades. And we better well make sure that it's not screwed up. So that covers things for this week. And we will be with you next week, hopefully in one piece. And do not accept a single wooden penguin unless it's well varnished, in which case maybe you might want to have it for decorative purposes. Okay, ending our stream.